On October the 7th, 2023, the fake settler colonial apartheid state that was made legal by the world, Israel, had the walls of its biggest concentration camp breached by a united front. This attack was suddenly placed into a vacuum by the West and so-called Israel, so that the retaliation and the rhetoric could mirror 9/11.
It's gonna be a big bang.
However, October 7th does not exist in a vacuum, as Israel has a long history of fascism, occupation, violence, ethnic cleansing, and genocide. This video was made to cement that Israel and its occupation of all of Palestine is not only just fascist, but illegal, and Palestinians have a right to resist, a right to a free Palestine, a Palestine free of. For over 75 years, Palestine has been occupied by a settler colonial state known as Israel, which used an ideology known as political Zionism to conquer Palestine and has tried to restore the biblical empire of ancient Israel. Although I frame this as a thing of the past, it's our current, present, and possibly the future. Faced with a brutal fascist occupation that inflicts on a daily basis suffering, pain, loss, death, theft of land, dehumanization, torture, psychological warfare, and other injustices, Palestinians are yet again in a position of a second Nakba, and there seems to be one way out: resistance, liberation, or total extermination. On the flip side, the roots of this resistance is an occupation driven by political Zionism, and so this video aims to take on two Herculean tasks. First, it aims to expose political Zionism and the occupation of Palestine. Second, it aims to contrast political Zionism with Palestinian resistance, which for weeks now has been framed as violent. But Frantz Fanon, the apostle of violence, has stated throughout his books that anti-colonial movements do not simply take aim to destroy things, but resist spiritually, economically, socially, and culturally. All of these forms of resistance are embedded in anti-colonial and anti-imperial struggles for liberation. What this video aims not to do is promote any kind of anti-Semitism. First, and as will be explained later, this video is anti-political Zionism, which differs from Judaism. Second, being anti-political Zionist does not mean to be against Jewish people, and there are thousands of Jewish people who are currently standing with Palestine. They have been fighting against genocide and the occupation.
How I got out of Zionism.
So if you're equating political Zionism to Judaism and all Jewish people, stop it immediately, because you're only hindering the Palestinian movement. And if you think this video is going to feed into any anti-Semitic conspiracies, you're dead wrong. There will not be any Jews rule the world on this channel, and if you're being anti-Semitic in the comments, I will shadow ban you. I do not tolerate anti-Semitism. This video is hyper-focused on being anti-political Zionist, anti-colonialist, and anti-imperialist. Before we begin, let's talk foundations. Where do we even begin? This video is structured differently than other history video essays who tend to use the conventional methodology of linear history telling. But Palestinian history isn't linear, but circular. Thus, we shall begin in the eternal present and weave back in time into the future and slowly weave back to the eternal present. This video has foundations rooted in indigenous circular storytelling that has been gifted to me by indigenous scholars. It's also rooted in Alana Feldman's ideas on temporality, time, and limbo, and also Noor Mashallah's ideas on the eternal present. We thus begin in the present, for history isn't linear, but a circle, and with our stories we are forever weaving it. In the eternal present, we are witnessing a genocide and an ethnic cleansing taking place in Gaza. A genocide that is fully sponsored by the Imperial Core, and yet a young historian, a baby historian, who is oblivious to the history may ask, how did all this happen? But Palestinians who are entrapped in an eternal present can easily explain how all of this happened. You don't need volumes of history to explain what is happening because it isn't complex. Further, you don't need volumes of history or a video essay to stand with Palestine and fight for liberation. October 7th was a response to an ongoing occupation and an apartheid state that has locked and restricted every single movement, every single action the Palestinians make in their own country since 1948. The logic behind apartheid in this case isn't race. As some deep Sen explains, the divide is a European settler colonial group who have attached themselves to attributes of whiteness, such as civility, civilization, and have the most pristine Western values, in opposition to those who they police, the others, the inferior. The Palestinians are constantly dehumanized and are seen by the Israeli state as barbaric, uncivilized, unproductive, and have immoral values and are a threat, and thus they are tossed into a jungle status. Occupied Palestine is thus a giant carceral state. October 7th was thus a break in the walls of Israel's concentration camp of Gaza. A concentration camp that doesn't just serve to contain Gazans through the use of its massive walls, but with a 15-year blockade and a denial of the most simplest of human rights. October 7th was a moment in a long string of moments where Palestinians have vocally stated that enough is enough. And finally, October 7th was not a spontaneous event, but rather the use of Islam as an anti-colonial force, and other factions' motivations can be traced historically to Algeria to 1936 and the anti-imperial struggle in general. But more on this later, as we are currently in the present and not the past. The response, the retaliation of Israel, bombing everything, is not a new phenomena, but rather historically there is a long tradition of Israel bombing or invading Gaza, motivated by the colonial effort to break the spirit of all of the Palestinians and to further occupy their lands.
Yani they took someone, Sarah.
Musa.
They took Musa.
Musa.
They took Musa. Yeah.
Israel has always taken aim to make the Palestinians passive to its occupation, and although the destruction, the death, the suffering, and the images are historic, the violence is not. What the present shows is rather a norm in Palestine, as Israel has routinely used violence. And they have routinely covered it up and denied it with the lie that all of this violence is self-defense. Why has Israel's retaliation been so severe and so cruel? Well, massacres and violence have always been a part of Israel's plan to conquer all of Palestine, as we only have to look at 1948, where Israel used violence to force Palestinians out of their villages. And by violence, I don't mean pointing a gun, but mass murder and destruction. But one must also consider Gaza's role in all this. As Edward Said said, Gaza has always been the heart of the resistance, and this can be traced from this eternal present to the past. Said has noted that it was in Gaza where most Palestinian resistance movements formed, and thus what is happening in the present is Israel going masks off, committing a genocide in Gaza in the vein of forever destroying Palestinian resistance, but also to psychologically shake Palestinians who resist by simply living in Gaza. The displacement of 1.1 million people is deeply connected to Israel's plan to simply shipping the Palestinians off to other Western settler colonies. This is a second Nakba. Plain and simple, it's ethnic cleansing. When we get to 1948, Nur Mashallah proves that transfer has always been a core of political Zionism and its conquest of Palestine. But in contrast, the voices of Palestinians and their actions deeply reject transfer, as for over 75 years, they have demanded a right to return. Even if Palestinians are refugees in their own lands, even if Palestine is currently wiped off every single map, even if Gaza is bombed day in and day out for over 50 days straight, the Palestinians will scream and shout to the world, boldly and proudly stating that they are still there, that they still exist, and with resistance, they will forever exist.
بعديها بندفن حتى في أرضي، بندفن تحت الزراعة، في أرضي بدي أنا أزرع أنا.
ما بدك تسيبي أرضك بالمرة؟
بالمرة.
رغم إنك هلا كتير بردانة ويمكن جوعانة وما في أدوية والوضع صعب، برضو مش حتطلعي؟
برضو مش حطلع. حضرنا صامدين.
هالقد بتحبي فلسطين؟
هالقد. أطفال فلسطين ما بتخلوش عنها. زي ما حكت الأغنية أنا دم فلسطيني أنا دم فلسطيني.
To say Palestine never existed is historically inaccurate and only feeds into Zionist denial. So let's travel back to the times before 1948, before 1917, to a time when Palestine existed free of Zionism, free of occupation and colonialism. A question arises. Where do we begin this story? Do we begin in the 5th century BCE, where the Greek scholar Herodotus inked the name Falastini? Do I need to go that far back? Do we begin with Constantine? Do we begin before Islam to explain to those who claim Arab Levantines were not indigenous to the land? As some claim that the Arabs just magically appeared one day with the Quran in their hands. Or do we begin at the start of Islam, where Muslims first prayed towards Jerusalem and Arabs in Palestine became Muslim through trade and not conquest? Or do we begin with the Khalifa Umar, who formed the province known as Palestine? Or the Crusades or Salah ad-Din, who not only retook the city, but showed compassion to both Christians and Jews? Or do we follow the long string of history of how after Salah ad-Din, Palestinians began to form their own identities? How Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived peacefully for centuries before 1917. Rather, the beginning of this Palestinian story begins at a four-way crossroads, and in the heart of Palestine, because Palestine before 1917 was arguably the heart of the Arab world, and its crossroads led all kinds of travelers to all kinds of magnificent ancient places. Its northern gates led travelers to Syria and the ancient city of Damascus and Aleppo. Its eastern gates and ships led others to Egypt and North Africa, to the ancient cities of Cairo and Alexandria. Its western gates led some to Iraq and Iran, to the ancient cities of Baghdad and Tehran. And its southern gates led all kinds of Muslims to their yearly pilgrimage to Mecca and the city of the Islamic prophet Muhammad. Its roads were well traveled, its cities well visited, and it became a home to a diverse population of people. It wasn't a barren, empty land where Arabs simply roamed around the desert naked, but a fully populated land filled with farmers, workers, and all kinds of scholars. There were Jewish people, some who were indigenous, while others fled persecution of a deeply anti-Semitic Europe. It was once a place where Muslims, Christians, and Jewish people lived peacefully. Although the Ottoman Empire wasn't all dandy, as non-Muslims had to pay a tax, the millet systems gave non-Muslims autonomy to self-govern themselves based on their religious laws, customs, and traditions. Thus, the millet system presents us with a direct contrast of how Palestine operated before proto-Zionists arrived on Palestinian shores in 1878, as the Ottomans had built a sophisticated refugee system so that when hundreds of thousands of Jews were expelled from Spain in 1942, they easily found refuge in all Ottoman lands, not just in Palestine. These Jewish refugees differed from Zionist settlers as they were not seen as foreigners by the natives, and they integrated into society. Thus, the disruption political Zionism brought to Palestine was not that mass amounts of Jewish people arrived, but that they were settlers who refused to integrate. They were also very hostile and rather set out to create pure Jewish settlements. People also claim that Palestine wasn't Palestine during the Ottoman Empire, but what they always leave out is the fact that Palestine was governed differently than other provinces due to its diversity, and the province was respected because of the efforts of Salah ad-Din, whose Khalifa passed Jerusalem off to the Ottomans. Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi ensured that Palestine had a special place in the Arab world, and thus his Khalifa and the Khalifa that came after allowed the place to function with little interference, and they even lessened the tax to lessen the burden on non-Muslims. Unlike other parts of the empire, which were built through the settlement of refugees, such as the Circassians in Syria and Jordan, Palestine was not strictly governed by the Ottomans. Thus, to claim that Palestine wasn't Palestine because it was part of the Ottoman Empire is so silly, and it washes over the history of Palestinians. Further, I've seen people claiming that there was no Palestine, or Syria, or Lebanon, and all of these countries were part of the region called Bilad ash-Sham. Yet Bilad ash-Sham historically consisted of 3 provinces that each housed a diverse population. Both Don Chatty and Laura Robson have extensively covered the history of Syria and Palestine before 1917. So go check them out and read their books. Not to brag or anything, but I've personally met with Professor Robson, and we vibed over bashing the UN and humanitarianism. So yeah, that's the thing. Finally, the Palestinians were not oblivious. As Rashid Khaldai notes in his book, The 100 Years' War on Palestine, Palestinians were very aware about the existence of political Zionism and its mission to colonize Palestine. Rashid Khaldai historically grounds this, as in 1899, the mayor of Jerusalem, Yusuf Dia, would send a letter to Theodor Herzl, where the mayor was not only familiar with Herzl's Die Judestat, but also told him, in the name of God, let Palestine be left alone. Yusuf thus did not tell Herzl to leave a random land in the Ottoman Empire, but Palestine, alluding to the fact that Palestine has been a province since the times of Umar al-Khattab. In the same letter, Yusuf cements that Palestinians inhabited Palestine and that they were not just some random people, but that they would not accept being taken over and were rather deeply attached to Palestine because they were indigenous. Rashid Khaldai does not bring these historical facts out of thin air, but is instead building off the history that his cousin wrote. Walid Khaldai is basically a foundational scholar in this history, and his early history on Palestine cements that people lived in Palestine for hundreds, if not thousands of years, which completely shatters the historical erasure enacted by political Zionists. Palestine was filled with people who loved their land. This early history of a Palestine before 1917 is not fictitious, as Walid Khaldai's monumentous works, such as All That Remains and his collaboration in helping make an encyclopedia of the Palestinians, document every aspect on Palestine, from its roads, to its buildings, to its people, to the labor, to every single one of its villages, before occupation, how they were occupied, and finally how they were depopulated. Thus, Palestine in the year 1917 was at a crossroads of history, and they had little to no agency for what was to come next. This is because the British did not just occupy Palestine, but they then went on to declare that Palestine, a land filled with people, would become a Jewish homeland for a people who apparently had no land. However, before we turn to 1917, let's instead turn to the origins of political Zionism.
Consequently, I know that Judaism and Zionism are not the same. Zionism had its first organizational expressions in 1897 in Basel, Switzerland, in Europe. Here was a man by the name of Theodor Herzl, H-E-R-Z-L. He was the founder of Zionism. He said that he was going to find the state that God promised the Jews. Listen to this very carefully. This man, Herzl, was an atheist. He believed that there was no God. He said God did not exist. Now, how is it that the man who believes that God does not exist is going to find a state that God promised to his chosen people? I tell you, this man is Satan in disguise. Zionism is a satanic movement. It is devil. It is imperialism. It is racist. It has gone and taken the lands of the Palestinian people and through terrorism has driven them out. And through terrorism, it maintains its power. And the United States of America, with over 6 million homeless, sends to Israel billions and billions and billions of dollars everywhere to bomb Palestinian people while homeless people are here and unemployed are here. Zionism is going to raise this war and make the people of America become clear.
In truth, this circle has two beginnings. Although most historians trace the origins of political Zionism to Theodor Herzl, other historians have dug further in this histography of Zionism in general. Hyman Loomer, for an example, traces classical Zionism to both Herzl and Leo Pinsker. However, it is Nur Mashallah who demonstrates that first, political Zionism was actually a radical break in a 2,000-year-long Jewish tradition that had developed its own history, language, tradition, and culture. Nur Mashallah bases her analysis off Eric Hobsbawm and his works on the invention of tradition. Both Loomer and Mashallah trace the roots of political Zionism to Germanic nationalism, the Germanic Enlightenment, to the anti-Semitism at the time, and that it was further anti-Semitic itself. Created in the heights of scientific racism, colonialism, and imperialism, political Zionism followed the Germanic nationalist movement by inventing a biological Jewish race who had a divine genetic passport to Palestine, and it was also anti-Semitic, as Hyman Loomer points out, that political Zionists believed that anti-Semitism was incurable and eternal. The genetic passport was justified by the use of the Bible, and it helped political Zionism argue that Jewish people were a distinct holy race who had ingenuity in Palestine. The Zionists weren't settlers. No! They were just people returning to their homeland, a land called Palestine, a land that already had Palestinians. However, it wasn't Herzl who took on the task to rewrite history and reinvent a Zionist nationalism. Mashallah instead credits Heinrich Graetz and Russian Simon Dubnow. These two prominent Jewish historians went on to reconstruct a collective national consciousness of Judaism as an ancient nationalism existing from time immemorial by using Jewish and non-Jewish sources. However, the history political Zionists reinvented was not only divorced from the Jewish collective memory, but it was a history that was at odds with it. Further, Zionist nationalism was contested, as Hans Kohn writes, Zionist nationalism had nothing to do with Jewish traditions. It was in many ways opposed to them. Thus, the colonization of Palestine was baked in the DNA of political Zionism, and Herzl would use all the theoretical inventions at the time to spearhead the movement by justifying the colonization of Palestine by using 4 key points. First, the anti-Semitism of Europe. Second, the idea that Jewish people couldn't assimilate in Western societies and would only be safe in Palestine. Third, the Bible, as it apparently backed the Jewish claim to Palestine, and Herzl continuously claimed that Palestine was a land with no people for a people with no land. And fourth, the creation of a Zionist state would aid European imperialism and would form a part of a wall of defense of Europe and Asia, a kind of outpost against barbarism. However, Herzl's political Zionism and its inherent anti-Semitism did not go uncontested, as Herzl was continuously called out by other Jewish figures who found political Zionism's treatment of Jewish as a race a hallmark of classical anti-Semitism. According to Thomas Suarez, Herzl fought back, calling Zionists the standard by which good Jews and bad Jews can be distinguished. Herzl would further state the common Zionist phrase, "No Jew can be an anti-Zionist." Although Herzl hated traditional Jews, the contested ground stemmed further, as even in its infancy, Zionism was anti-Semitic. This anti-Semitism would get exposed by Berlin correspondent for the London Standard, who reported on the First Zionist Congress of 1897 in an article called "The Idea of Founding a Modern Jewish State." The correspondent would write, "Which goes by the name of Zionism, finds little favor in Germany, except among the anti-Semites. The Kolnitschi calls it one of the greatest utopias of our time, and the Frankfurter Zeitung sums up an article on the subject as follows. In short, the degradation which calls itself anti-Semitism has begotten the degradation which adorns itself the name of Zionism." Suarez would conclude this chapter with Zionism handed anti-Semites a way of sending Jews elsewhere while looking progressive. However, Suarez doesn't stop beating Zionism with anti-Semitic allegations, as he later cites the historian Lucian Wolff, who pointed out that Zionism harms Jewish people. After at first being open to Herzl's ideas, but after a year of digesting the inner meanings of the settler movement, Wolff would come to condemn Zionism as being anti-Semitic, writing, "Conceive of no more serious setback for Jewish history and the Jewish struggle for equality than the Zionist scheme." Thus, the anti-Zionist Jewish movements seen in the present can be linked back to Zionism's origins. Herzl, before winning the favor of the British, resembles Zelensky as he traveled from country to country pitching and begging them to support the Zionist project to colonize Palestine, because without a European power, the Ottomans wouldn't have allowed a European settler colony in their empire. Finding no success with the German Kaiser, who brushed them off, Herzl first turned to Cecil Rhodes, who at the time had a colonial venture in South Africa. Herzl was a deep admirer of Rhodes and his colonial ventures. Rhodes would give Herzl an opportunity to make his pitch to the British, where he at first wanted Cyprus to be a testing ground, but that was rejected, as the British did not want a new European settlement where other whites settled. It's here where Argentina and Uganda were brought up, but Herzl argued that only Palestine would bring the rebirth of the Jewish homeland. Although the British did have a prominent amount of Christian Zionists, it wasn't religion that made Arthur Balfour write the Balfour Declaration. Rather, it was British geopolitical interests in the region. And as Suarez stresses, Balfour himself was anti-Semitic. Suarez grounds this claim by showcasing how in 1905, Bloody Balfour blocked the immigration of millions of Jews fleeing pogroms in Tsarist Russia, citing the undoubted evils that had fallen upon Britain from these Jews. And 12 years later, he would be the man who would write a declaration that would become a legal basis for turning Palestine into a Zionist settler state. Thus, Zionism was inherently colonial, and when it was put into practice, it clearly resembled other colonial movements. The intent to colonize was made apparent by both Herzl, Cecil Rhodes, and later the Ahmar Jabotinsky. But there have been a number of scholars who have investigated the colonial and national nature of political Zionism, from Walid Khaldai to Edward Said to Ilan Pape to Maxine Rodinson to Hyman Loomer to Rashid Khaldai to Thomas Suarez to Noor Mashallah and Samdeep Sen. But these are only a handful of scholars, as this historiography is vast. before we turn to 1917, I need to make a few distinctions. First, Britain promised the Arabs independence if they revolted against the Ottomans. But a promise carries little weight in comparison to a declaration, and it's important to understand the weight the Balfour Declaration carried. In Rashid Khaldai's point of view, the Balfour Declaration was a declaration of war, and it marks the start of the 100-Year War on Palestine. While Noor Mashallah stresses that the Balfour Declaration was a colonial declaration that took aim to give all of Palestine to Zionist settlers. Second, people in the comments are going to try and refute my Palestine before 1917 or 1948 part by claiming that it was called Mandate Palestine. But just like the Zionist occupation, so-called Mandate Palestine was an illegal, illegitimate occupation that was continuously rejected by Palestinians. The British had no right in occupying Palestine or any other parts of the Middle East, and they had no right to simply give Palestine to European Zionist settlers. Further, to the people who plan on writing me an essay about how Palestine didn't exist before 1917, you are doing exactly what the British and political Zionists did and continue to do. You are erasing 2,000 years of history, and although the mighty Balfour never names Palestine or Palestinians, it was written by a racist anti-Semite who participated in the erasure of Palestine. So to conclude this part and clarify some things for the next chapter, political Zionism has roots in Nazi nationalism, in radical nationalism, as both originate from the Volkisch movement, which stated and professed that a people of common descent should separate and form a state. Political Zionists were also obsessed with the mythic past and rewriting history. They would revive the dead ancient Hebrew language and attach themselves to Palestinian soil by claiming that they will redeem the land and transform it. All these theories would come into practice once the colonization of Palestine began, as political Zionism since the beginning aimed to conquer Palestine and transferring the Arabs out. We now turn not to 1917, but 1878. (1878) marks the first Zionist colony in Palestine, which was backed by millionaire Baron Edmund James D. Rothschild, who at the time sent proto-Zionists to Palestine. And looking at this map is like playing a jolly game of Where's Waldo, but I guess that would be called Where's the Proto-Zionist Colony? Can you spot it? It took me a minute to find that singular blue dot surrounded by Palestinian towns and cities. There are two historical accounts that shed light on these proto-Zionists. The first comes from the mayor of Jerusalem, who in his letter to Herzl mentioned the hostility proto-Zionists had towards the Palestinians around them, that they differed from Jewish people of the past who fled persecution and found all Islamic lands safe havens, because the proto-Zionists were clearly European, they were clearly foreign, meaning they were ajanib. They refused to integrate, and rather they aimed to build pure Jewish settlements. The second account comes from a cultural Zionist who at the time condemned political Zionism. In 1891, Asher Ginsberg stood witness and documented proto-Zionists trespassing and beating Palestinians. This account would prove everything Yusuf wrote in his letter for those who do not trust Arab sources that are anecdotal. So from the start, one can see that Zionist settlers were hostile and that they carried an air of superiority, but things would wrap up once the British occupied Palestine in 1917. One thing to note was that British Mandate Palestine differed from other mandates, as the Palestinians were denied their political rights, and instead the mandate gave Zionist settlers rights. These rights would be embedded into the articles of the mandate because the Balfour Declaration was a legal document. The two important articles were, first, Zionist settlers had the right to dictate immigration, which would allow more settlers in and for them to dominate the economy. Second, Article 7, the nationality laws gave Zionist settlers rights to national rights while denying Palestinians their rights, and this would become super important in 1948 with the denial of the right to return. Suarez also adds on these nationality laws, as in 1929, before any Central European power, the Zionist settlers mandated race laws, which claimed that Jewish blood was pure and it became illegal to marry a non-Jewish person. It's here, in these laws, where we see those theoretical national ideas put into practice, and they eerily resemble Nazi Germany and the USA. Mandate Palestine looked like Jim Crow America, as from 1922 to 1929, Zionist settlers started segregating playgrounds and schools, and the logic behind this was based on so-called Jewish ethics, that Palestinian kids would corrupt Jewish children. However, the Zionist settlers would thus use the British to pacify the Arabs and the Christians, as Jabotinsky would call for an iron wall to completely demolish any Arab resistance. And at the start, this iron wall was represented by the British, who protected new Zionist settlements. The British would first pacify them politically, as the elite of society, both Arab and Christian, tried to peacefully protest the declaration, but according to the British, they had no political rights, only Zionists did, and thus they were ignored. It's important to know that Palestinian elites would collaborate with both the British and Zionist settlers. Ghassan Kanafi covers this in depth when getting into the failures of the 1936 revolt. And then in 1936, normal Palestinians felt enough was enough and staged a strike and an armed revolt against the British occupation. The Arab attacks couldn't be suppressed at first, so the British shipped in 100,000 troops to Palestine and used tactics they perfected in suppressing the Irish in Palestine, such as using human shields. The Arab revolt of 1936 to 1939 was brutally crushed, which signaled to Zionist settlers that it was the perfect time to mass arm settlers. Looming in the background was the Hamar Jabotinsky, a revisionist right-wing Zionist who admired Mussolini's fascism. Although Jabotinsky operated mostly in Poland, he would indoctrinate and train Polish Zionists, who were known as his children, to hate and dehumanize Palestinians. Jabotinsky stressed the need to rebuild the Third Temple with the blood of the Arabs and use their blood to purify the homeland. Jabotinsky's children have been noted by historians to mirror Hitler's youth, and he would send his recruits to Palestine. The militant Zionists Jabotinsky raised and taught would form the violent militarist organization known as UNRWA after the 1929 Arab riots, and he was the founder. But in Palestine, there was a second Zionist violent group known as Lehi, also known as Stern Gang, founded by Avraham Stern. So, from 1929 to 1939, Zionist settlements grew because of the protection of the British, but also because Erdogan slowly began terrorizing Palestinians and displacing them. Thomas Suarez notes that the years from 1939 to 1944 were the years of terror in Palestine. And this violence wasn't simply directed at Palestinians, but Jews who were anti-Zionist and the British. By 1939, the British support for Zionism waned because of a Second World War and the 1936 revolts, causing them to restrict Jewish immigration to Palestine. And due to this fact, Zionists grew tired of the British and wanted their independence. This led to some interesting alliances, as the Lehi attempted to form an alliance with the Axis powers, as the Lehi were very anti-British and they were pro-Axis. Their slogan was, "With blood and fire, Judea will rise." In fact, the anti-Semitism I showcased in part 3 was fully unmasked in this time period, as Zionist leaders were anti-assimilationist. For example, in 1938, US President Roosevelt brought representatives from 32 nations to resettle Jewish targets of Nazism, and yet the World Zionist Organization refused to participate because Palestine wasn't chosen as a target. They instead argued that an open, safe haven for Jews would weaken their project. In late 1941, when Jews were literally being carted off to death camps by the trainload, the Irgun dismissed any attempts to offer them safe haven outside of Palestine because it was anti-Semitic. And finally, Suarez showcases how in 1944, President Roosevelt tried again to secure safe haven for 500,000 displaced people, but outraged Zionist leaders sabotaged it. Safe haven in the US and other safe countries, as Roosevelt's aide Morris Ernst bitterly put it, endangered the Zionist pet thesis that Jews must only go to Palestine. Mind you, Zionists prioritized their settler colonial project over Jewish lives in the fucking Holocaust. Both Herzl and later Jabotinsky called for a need of a perpetual anti-Semitism for their Zionist state to succeed. Dr. Irha Altman clarifies their stance, writing, "Anti-Semitism must form the foundations of Zionist propaganda, that there was and still is a need to keep alive the threat of anti-Semitism." So all of this is to say, Lehi, Erdogan, and other fascist militant Zionist groups in Palestine vibed with Nazi Germany and Mussolini's fascist Italy because they basically forced mass displaced Jews to go to Palestine and not other safe Western countries. Thus, the core tenet of Zionism, that anti-Semitism is incurable and eternal, was put into place, and violence was enacted on Jewish people who were pro-assimilation and anti-Zionist. In many ways, not only did Zionist nationalism mirror Nazi nationalism, but so did its usage of violence and terror. Thus, the Nazi ties do not end with Zionism's anti-assimilation stance, but rather in the violence Lehi and Erdogan enacted in Palestine. In 1943, a U.S. intelligence report cited the German weak Orient as an example where it condemned the Yishuv Nazis and their super-Zionism, which was said to be as bad as German super-nationalism, as it stressed the need for purity of blood and to be ethnically pure. There was also a squad known as Z for Zionist, which would eventually form out of Zionist youth who were very much like Nazis and formed SS squads. Hence the violence, the terror, and the displacement did not begin in 1948, but rather in 1938, and the escalation of violence kept rising even when the UN General Assembly was voting. Although many Palestinians were killed by Zionist violent activities, there was no retaliation from the Palestinians. The idea was to provoke and then attack. I wish I could get into the violence, but I'm kind of worried that if I went bullet by bullet, action after action, YouTube wouldn't allow this video to be viewed. So instead, read Thomas Suarez and you'll come to the same conclusion I came to. The question shouldn't be, do you condemn Hamas? But do you condemn Zionism? Because as Suarez proves, Zionists have always used violence and they haven't stopped. We now turn to how the UN fucked up big.
The United Nations has made its decision on Palestine. The map shows what partition means.
In 1947, a 2-year-old, a little baby UN, decided to place the entire fate of Palestine on a singular vote. And they fucked up big. The UN General Assembly was really Britain's escape plan, as even in 1947, Zionist settler violence did not cease. And instead of taking responsibility and taking action in 1935, the British instead planned their exit and they did not care about the fate of Palestine. For just this one part, I'm gonna rip the professional historian facade and speak from my heart. I think the UN vote to determine the self-determination of any people is utter bullshit. And what angers me is that this was a 2-year-old UN that knew nothing. It did not know about Palestine before 1947. It didn't know about the terrorism or the hostility Zionist settlers brought. It was very much a Eurocentric organization made by the global north. Based on these facts, any armed resistance that stemmed after 1948 were totally justifiable because the UN vote didn't make a settler colonial state real or legitimate. Sure, it became legal worldwide, but in the eyes of the Palestinians, the indigenous peoples of that land, Israel wasn't real. It wasn't legitimate. And the Zionist settlers went against the UN and started their conquest once the vote was cast. Second, what determines a people's self-determination? Is it a body of white global north politicians who have a long history of imperialism and colonialism in Algeria, Vietnam, Korea, South Africa, and Rhodesia. No occupier state was ever legitimate, even if the UN backed their legitimacy, even if the USA acknowledged them and supported them. Finally, other nations in the UN saw it as unjust, and the global north tends to wish to fix problems. And Palestine, to these white people, was just another problem. Yet, the impact was seismic. The impact of the vote shows tremendous error. Because even back then, political Zionism was known as a fascist settler colonial movement. In conclusion, fuck the UN, fuck America, fuck Britain, fuck France, and fuck Israel. Okay, let's talk about this more. Let's talk about the vote a bit more professionally. In the era of decolonization, a fact was made. Only white nations had the right to self-determination. And this fact led thinkers like Vladimir Lenin and later Ho Chi Minh and Frantz Fanon and many other Palestinian intellectuals to argue that for people in the global south, self-determination was a thing that needs to be fought for and won. This would become the basis for theories like decolonization, anti-colonialism, and anti-imperialism. Although Lenin taught Ho Chi Minh, those who taught and inspired Fanon to write about decolonization and violence were Islamic freedom fighters in Algeria. Further, those who inspired later Palestinian resistances were a collective of struggles, and I could trace the Islamic anti-colonial tradition beyond Algeria, as it motivated Sheikh Aziz al-Qasim to rise and fight in 1936. Later on, the UN would also recognize that a people have a right to resist an occupation, and that's exactly what Israel is. Because once the vote was cast, Zionist settlers were not happy with the 70% they were given, even though they made up 18% of the population. Rather, the Zionist settlers would wage a war against the Palestinians and slowly conquer everything, leaving the Gaza Strip and tiny pockets in the West Bank. Before we turn to 1948 and the Nakba, let's recontextualize ourselves historically and explain how Zionist settlers used the British. Zionist settlers first used the British for patronage and to attain self-autonomy. Second, British military was needed to suppress any native resistance. Third, the Mandate Articles would become the foundations of a Zionist state, as the British basically built a political apparatus for Zionist settlers to jump off of. And fourth, British stewardship enabled Zionist settlers to juxtapose themselves as indigenous and seek liberation from the British colonizers, and thus the 1948 war for conquest became one of independence. One last thing before we turn. For anyone who challenges my take on the UN, please read Annie Irfan's analysis on the UN in regards to Palestine in the future. Annie Irfan showcases how the UN serves the global north and how they aid Israel's occupation of Palestine. There have also been moments where the UN was ineffective, such as in 1957 when Britain and France waged war against Egypt. Israel joined Britain and France and seized on the opportunity by invading and occupying Gaza, where they mass murdered Gazans. In 1957, both the USSR and the USA attempted to use the UN to call for a ceasefire, but Britain vetoed it and continued the war. The same thing happened recently, as on December 8th, 2023, where the US vetoed a ceasefire, and because of the veto, the bombs continue to drop, the murder continues, the genocide continues. So fuck the UN and how useless it is. We now turn to 1948, the Nakba and hidden histories.
Palestine becomes an armed camp. Haganah troops search for Arabs after capturing the city. Arab strong points are taken after being blasted to rubble. During the mopping up operations, Haganah forces seek out every Arab, and barricades are set up to screen those who had not already fled the city. Everyone is searched. With the relinquishing of the British mandate, Palestine is rocked by full-scale war, and both sides mobilize. Arab captives are held for evacuation to Acre. Women flee with what belongings they can carry. And as Palestine struggles for national existence, the United Nations wrestles with the problem.
Immediately after the 1948 UN General Assembly vote, Zionist settlers began the Nakba. And the one-day-year-old state would break the UN partition plan by attacking Palestinian villages and displacing them, initiating a conquest of Palestine. However, the Nakba and the trauma that came with it isn't simply about displacement, but rather that for almost 75 years, there has been a denial of memory and a denial of the atrocities. In many respects, it's a hidden history. Hence, the Palestinians weren't simply robbed of their lands, their villages, but they were also prevented from remembering and imagining a future without occupation. Some living in Israel would be encouraged not to mourn the loss of Palestine, but to celebrate the birth of their occupation. The Nakba, the displacement, dispossession, and occupation through the use of ethnic cleansing has always been a part of political Zionism's plan from the very beginning, but it was masked with the progressive term transfer. Herzl's solution for the so-called indigenous problem was, who would think of sending them away? In secret, Herzl even wrote that in order for Zionism to succeed, the Palestinians must disappear, that a Zionist state would thus be built upon the ruins of a Palestinian. After the signing of the Balfour Declaration, T.E. Lawrence of Arabia mulled a horrifying question. Do Jews propose a complete expulsion of the Arab peasantry? Yes, T.E. Lawrence, yes they did. Baron Edmund James D. Rothschild had his own plans, writing, as he advised me to carry on in similar activities, but it is better, he said, not to transfer the Arabs to Syria or Transjordan, as these are parts of the land of Israel, but to Mesopotamia. He added in these cases, he would be ready to send the Arabs, at his expense, new agricultural machines and agricultural advisors. In the 1940s, the first director of the JNF, Yusuf Witz, would come to conceive and orchestrate the transfer of the Palestinians. As he wrote in his diary, it must be clear that there is no room in this country for both people. If Arabs leave it, the country will become wide and spacious for us. The only solution is a land of Israel without Arabs. There is no way but to transfer the Arabs from here to the neighboring countries, to transfer all of them, perhaps with the exception of Bethlehem, Nazareth, and the old Jerusalem. Not one village must be left, not one tribe. Thus, for over 48 years of planning, the ethnic cleansing and the destruction of Palestine began, and it began with massacres. Noor Mashallah and Walid Khaldai go into great lengths to illustrate the brutality of the conquest and the patterns of genocide. So if you want to learn more, read their books. I'm going to focus on one of the most brutal. It took place in Galilee. The Galilee expulsions demonstrate clear examples of how massacres were used to intimidate Palestinians into flight. On October 29 to the 31st, the Israeli army led a large military campaign called Operation Haram. The operation was characterized by murder and a range of brutalities carried out against the Palestinian civilians. On November 9th, Yusuf Nahmani, the director of the JNF, would write in his diary describing the actions of Irgun, Lehi, and the IDF. In Safsaf, after the inhabitants had raised a white flag, the soldiers collected and separated the men and women, tied the hands of 56 Fallahin, and shot and killed them and buried them in a pit. Also, they raped several women. At Alibun and Fereda, the soldiers had been greeted with white flags and rich food. And afterwards, he had ordered the villagers to leave with their women and children. When the villagers had begun to argue, the soldiers had opened fire, and after some 30 people were killed, had begun to lead the rest towards Lebanon. In Salah, where white flags had been raised, they had killed about 67 men and women. Where did they come by such measures of cruelty? Like Nazis. Is there a more humane way of expelling the inhabitants than such methods? Nur Mashallah goes to list 22 massacres after this, all showing the same pattern of gathering the men and murdering them, but there's also sexual violence and the murder of children and women. In fact, the massacres continued because both Irgun and Lehigh, these extremist militias, were integrated into the IDF and none of them got punished. Instead, these murderers carried pride in mass murder.
3-4 חודשים הראשונים הייתי רוצח.
מה זה אומר?
אני לא לקחתי שבויים. בזמן קרב, אם מישהו ירים ידיים, משהו כזה, לא לקחתי שבויים. זה זעזע אותי עד כדי כך, לא יכלתי לעבור לסדר היום. אם היה עומדת כיתה של זה עם ידיים למעלה, אז באותו יום הייתי רואה אותי, הייתי קוצר את כולם, עד כדי כך.
כמה אתה חושב אנשים הרגת ככה?
לא ספרתי. אני לא יכול לדעת בחיי. היה לי מקלע עם 250 כדורים. תראה, יריתי, נלחמתי כולם. אני לא יכול לספור.
On November 17th, 1948, all these atrocities even led to Erhan Zisling to say, I often disagree when the term Nazi was applied to the British, but even though the British committed Nazi crimes, but now Jews too have behaved like Nazis, and my entire being has been shaken. Although historians tend to rightfully focus on atrocities and the massacres, hundreds of Palestinians died from illness, thirst, and exhaustion during the death marches. In the eternal present, we are witnessing the movement of 1.1 million people who are not even allowed to move peacefully, and in many ways, it resembles the forced displacement of 750,000 Palestinians in 1948. A commander of the Arab Legion, John Hulb Pasha, even carefully wrote, "Nobody will ever know how many children died." The lack of information on the dead, or how many died, was because the Israeli state took active measures in cleaning up towns they destroyed, they actively secured archival material, and they refused to give the Palestinians a sliver of a right to mourn the dead and the destruction of Palestine. Denial became a cornerstone of the Nakba. Palestinians were denied the right to remember, the right to write their own histories. They were denied a right to return as their villages became military zones. They were denied human rights, denied a right to self-determination, a right to be Palestinian. And rather they became refugees in their own country. They became stateless, a humanitarian problem. As Israel was built off the destruction of a Palestinian state, of Palestinian villages, they would deny the existence of these villages by changing their names and growing invasive forests or resorts for tourists. But even with all this denial, Palestinians haven't forgotten, and many have kept their keys, hoping that someday they will return, hoping that Palestine will be free from river to sea. The Nakba was a traumatic historical fracturing point for Palestinians, and after it happened, many did not want to tell their stories out of shame, and when the PLO came around, they refused to let refugees tell their own stories because of this shame. Instead, the PLO wanted to tell a heroic story, but historians have recovered the history of the Nakba through the uses of oral history. The oral history of the Nakba does a better job covering the atrocities than Israeli sources because the Israeli sources intentionally cover things up. When I first learned about the Nakba, I cried. As an effective historian, I grew angry. Alana Feldman frames life after the Nakba and life in refugee camps in a framework of temporalities. The Palestinians for over 75 years have been imprisoned in an eternal present, in an eternal limbo, unable to dream or imagine a future. It was here where I first used the theory of lost futures, but not in a Fisher or a Derrida sense, but that in part of resistance is fighting against lost futures and for a future. The Nakba motivated a lot of people who were stuck in an eternal present to once again dream and hope of returning to the land of Palestine through resistance. A land that is free of occupation, violence, dehumanization, torture, and where death is cheap. A future where Palestine is free. Although I frame this as a hidden history, as it is hidden from Israeli citizens, many historians and artists have placed a spotlight on the Nakba and have exposed the genocidal nature of political Zionism, but many still do deny. We are currently witnessing a second Nakba, and so unlike the first, let none of the names go forgotten, let none of the pain and the suffering go forgotten. And if you're as angry as I am, take a stand and fight for a future, for that's my lost futures. We now turn to an Algerian Aside, and how Frantz Fanon found peace with the Muslims in Algeria.
French troops leave Hanoi forever, but many of them are headed for another long, bloody war in Algeria.
If you've ever read Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, you'd come to find that there's an elephant in his book. It's an elephant called Islam. 6 years after the Nakba, in 1954, a revolutionary war would break out in Algeria, where the Algerians fought against their French occupiers who had occupied Algeria for over a century. The revolution was led mainly by the National Liberation Front, but it was also fought by nationalists and communists. However, the group Fanon joined were the National Liberation Front, and although his Wretched of the Earth never mentions it, the FLN used a mixture of Marxism and Islam in their revolution. The peasants Fanon praises throughout his books were not just some random peasants who were just spontaneous and anti-colonial. No, they were Muslims who used Islam as an anti-colonial force to mobilize the population. In fact, Islam has a history of being anti-colonial, as it wasn't just used in Algeria, but all over Africa and the Middle East. Fanon was also very aware of the Islamic nature of the National Liberation Front, because he helped edit their newspaper called El Mujahid. Thus, Fanon actively supported a group who called themselves Mujahideen, and their revolution was a jihad. That's right, Fanon was pro-jihad. Fawzi Sicily, in his 2 articles on Fanon and Islam, goes into great lengths to explain to white readers what both these terms mean in an Islamic context, and how after 9/11, figures like Bernard Lewis and later Samuel Huntington masked them with Judeo-Christian values. First, Mujahideen are not crusaders who are fighting a holy war, and jihad cannot be framed as a holy war, because in Islam, holiness is only attached to the one God, for all Muslims believe that there is no God but God. And shirk, one of the greatest sins, is actually when one tries to usurp God and impose supreme power onto people. Shirk in Islam is a great injustice because it brings other injustices, and thus it is a Muslim's duty to resist and struggle. In truth, jihad simply means to struggle, and it's all about justice and fighting injustice. Once this injustice ceases, the jihad ceases. Thus, the FLN's struggle was not one rooted in a so-called Islamic holy war, but in concrete secular things, such as the French forcefully stole their lands, stole their wealth, and forcefully occupied them, and used its supreme colonial power to try and civilize them. This brings us back to Fanon, and Fanon went after his white racist comrades who saw Muslims as inferior, but Fanon had an advantage over his European comrades, in that he was attentive to the racist dynamics as he had experienced a similar level of racism in France. Fanon also differed as he was very conscious of his own colonial mannerisms, and rather Fanon listened and saw and treated the Algerians as equals. Fanon, the apostle of violence, at first struggled with armed resistance, and he only came to terms with armed resistance when he heard a speech given by an Algerian Jew who made Fanon reflect as he wrote, "I still had too much unconscious anti-Arab to be convinced by a Muslim Arab. It took an Algerian Jew to shake me." The apostle of violence was actually once a man who needed a good shake to convince him, but this makes him even more authentic as he addresses his own biases. Sicily stresses in both articles that it wasn't Fanon who taught the Algerians the ABCs of anti-colonialism. Rather, it was Muslim and Jewish Algerians who shook him, and they were the ones who motivated him to write about his experiences in Algeria, which became The Wretched of the Earth. The Muslims in Algeria were called and seen as primitive peasants by Fanon's European comrades, but in truth it was their Islamic beliefs mixed with Marxism that created a revolutionary force. And in Fanon's book, they appear but they are never named. One example I loved was the peasants knew in their hearts of hearts that in order to attain liberation, there needed to be a total ejection of the French and fought assimilation. This knowledge also doesn't change Fanon's secularness. As in his book A Dying Colonialism, one can see his secular Marxism clash with Islam, where he talks about Islam's role in the future of Algeria. But never once during the struggle did Fanon condemn Islam. Never did he condemn the FLN as radical jihadists. Rather, Fanon supported Islam's role in the revolution, and he fully supported Islam in any struggle for liberation. Finally, Fanon was tormented by inaction, by being a witness to the horrendous torture of the Algerians. Fanon thus did not tolerate inaction, and he struggled to shake others. He felt the Europeans around him too apathetic. He began to truly despise the French, and he was so outraged, he threw his Frenchness aside and became an Algerian. He became human. You might be thinking, what does all this have to do with Palestine? Well, the Algerian Revolution clearly showcases a group of people who went from peasants to revolutionaries. And although the PLO and later the PFLP differ from the FLN, Islam has always played a role in resisting the colonizer. Actually, fuck it. Some of you are racist, orientalist piece of shits who would have been called out by Fanon. So many people out there who cheered for Ukraine are now silent as they watch Israel bomb the living hell out of Gaza. But since the resistance is made up of Muslims who use scary words such as jihad and read Quran, it's seen as a bad resistance. To conclude this part, what I want white secular leftists out there to understand is that Islam has a long history of anti-colonialism. Like, research Algeria, research Syria, Iraq, the Kurds, and Palestine. Challenge yourself like Fanon and reflect on your racism. Maybe my voice isn't enough to shake you, but maybe someone else's will. Thus we turn to the camps of UNRWA and how Palestinian peasants turned into freedom fighters.
People usually fight for something and they stop fighting for something. So you can't tell me even why should we speak about what?
Well, stop fighting.
For what? Or talk about stop fighting, why?
Talk to stop fighting to stop the death and the misery, the destruction, the pain.
The misery and the destruction and the pain and the death of whom?
Of Palestinians, of Israelis, of Arabs.
Of the Palestinian people who are uprooted, thrown in the camps, living in starvation, killed for 20 years, and forbidden to use even the name Palestinians.
They're better that way than dead, though.
Maybe to you, but to us, it's not. To us, to liberate our country, to have dignity, to have respect, to have our mere human rights, is something as essential as life itself.
The roots of Palestinian armed resistance can be traced back to 1929 and the Palestinian Revolt of 1936 to 1939. In fact, the now infamous Al-Qasim Brigades and the Islamic anti-colonial tradition found in Algeria can be traced back to Sheikh Aziz ad-Din al-Qasim, while prominent members of the PFLP were children during the 1936 revolt, such as Ghassan Kanafani. Those who lost parents in the British suppression grew up in a time of Zionist violence in the 1940s and would eventually find themselves scattered in camps. Thus, there were multiple factors that led peasants to turn to revolutionaries, and this is only a brief history of their struggle. In 1949, Palestinians became a problem, and the benevolent UN would create UNRWA to provide the now stateless Palestinians humanitarian aid. But UNRWA, this so-called apolitical institution, would become more than that, as it provided Palestinians in refugee camps an education, healthcare, ID cards, and emergency food. Some very, very political stuff. However, UNRWA couldn't be apolitical because although its volunteers were to remain silent and neutral, they witnessed the suffering of Palestinians and their continued oppression and occupation. As Matar Abdurrahim puts it, life in the camps was no life at all, as Palestinians lived in fear, grew hungry, and were subjected to depression. They were bitter, as refugees were subjugated, estranged, and dependent on others for everything. They were miserable, having lost everything, including their futures. Stories were told and shared, but they all ended in 1948. Memories reminded refugees of what they did not have and what they were missing. It led people to fight for simple things. Love, death, the vivid memory of harvesting wheat, memories of simply walking around their villages, smiles, dreams, agony, misery, the sounds of laughter. A world without worry and a loss of a future. But there was also a sense of despair, as Palestinians hoped other Arab countries would liberate them. All of these things would motivate Matar Abdurrahim to join the resistance, but he had to struggle with a question which was asked by an old teacher who turned into a resistance fighter after 1948. A long time has passed since we were displaced. Are we going to keep waiting? And who exactly are we waiting for to liberate our land? Thus, Matar Abdurrahim, for the first time in his life, saw a path to the future, and it was a path deeply linked with armed resistance and politics. One of his childhood friends was also a founder of the Arab nationalist movement in the 1950s, which would later splinter, forming the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, and the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Both of these organizations adopted a more Marxist and communist stance. Both of these groups include Muslims, Christians, anti-Zionist Jews, and are secular. The PFLP and the DFLP, since their inceptions, have rooted their struggle in anti-imperialism.
At the present moment, no. At the present moment, we should only be concerned with the American people. And we are against any relations, official relations, with the United States of America. Because we know that what we are facing here is actually American imperialism and not only Israel. All the raids we are facing in the Lebanon and before that in Palestine, we know that Israel is actually able to practice such bad deeds because of American backing of Israel. We want this to be very, very, very clear. And we in the PFLP, we always stress that our real enemy is not Israel only and Zionism. It is American imperialism who is backing Israel because Israel is playing a bodyguard for American imperialistic interests in Saudi Arabia and in the Gulf region. That is why we don't want at the present moment, and we refuse any relations with the American government.
But there was also the more moderate PLO, who in the 1960s and 70s resisted with violence. Although I'm focusing on one man, resistance in general gave those who lacked a future, those stuck in limbo, in an eternal present, life. The Palestinian resistance movements and the call for armed struggle was grounded in concrete grievances, be it the brutal suppression of the 1936 Arab revolts, the Israeli brutal massacres and occupation in 1948, the Israeli brutal massacres in 1957, and the occupation of Gaza. On top of that, there were the frustrations of living in despair in refugee camps, where the UN solution did absolutely nothing, and Israel hoped that in being placed in high security camps, the Palestinians would be pacified to their occupation, that they would simply give up hopes for a return and give up hopes of liberation. Even Hamas was born out of violence. As two of its co-founders witnessed brutal massacres, they stood witness to their friends and families get murdered in cold blood. And as Fanas says,
colonialism is not a thinking machine, nor a body endowed with reasoning faculties. It is violence in its natural state, and it will only yield when confronted with greater violence.
The straw that fractured the Palestinian resistance and halted things for some time was that the PLO used UNRWA to place themselves politically as the representatives of all Palestinians. The PLO would not only give up armed struggle, but condemned it, opting for a political solution in the 1990s. This led to Hamas, a very religious group, teaming up with the communist PFLP to oppose the PLO. Because in seeking a political solution, Yasser Arafat gave into a two-state solution. He recognized the occupation of his people as legitimate. Arafat thus accepted the occupation of Palestine and refused to seek liberation. Although the PLO achieved political recognition, they failed because political Zionists in Israel want to occupy everything. And in taking the so-called civilized route, the PLO did not only assimilate with their colonizers, but they joined them in oppressing Palestinians. Thus, Zionist colonialism does not simply seek to colonize Palestinian land, but it's a colonization of the spirit, the mind, and the heart. We now turn to the occupation and black skins, white masks in Palestine.
The reason why the peace process doesn't work is actually built on fraud. It's really built on fraud. It's built on this idea there's a kind of parity between Israel and Palestine. There is no parity. There's one power, a colonial power, colonizing the other side. It's not just occupation. 10, 20 years ago, we used to talk about occupation. What is occupation? Occupation, you have an occupying army, and you can shift this army. This army can move from one side to another side. If it was just occupation, then the army can withdraw. It's not just occupation, it's colonization.
To truly understand Palestinian resistance, one must first understand the nature of the occupation. The occupation of Palestine is perfectly framed by some deep Sen, who uses Fanon's allegory of black skins, white masks. This framing isn't centered around race, but rather here whiteness is attached to a group that is considered by the world as a civilized democratic nation, while the Palestinians are tossed into a perpetual jungle status. The Israelis live in luxury, in settlements that seem permanent. They have access to the cleanest of water, the most fertile grounds. They have access to billions of dollars that keeps their settlements afloat. And these billions of dollars also fund their military and the construction of checkpoints that litter the land. The wealth also goes into security measures, such as maintaining a 15-year blockade on the Gaza Strip. It also aided them in constructing massive walls that now concentrate 2 million people. The colonizers are attached to Western values and see themselves as civilized, cultured, and represent the most moral values. Although the colonizers seem stable, in truth, the Palestinian presence haunts them. The Palestinians, on the other hand, live in a state of uncertainty. They live in shacks and broken buildings, ever on the verge of being destroyed by their colonizers. They lack access to the most basic human rights. The right to clean water, the right to land, safety, the right to move freely, and even a right to life. The Palestinians thus represent the colonized, who are considered inferior to their occupiers, as they represent the uncivilized, the immoral, and are in a realm devoid of values. Those who occupy Palestine have long wished to break the spirit of the Palestinians, and some Palestinians have had a craving to be white, to escape their so-called jungle status. Some deep found instances where Palestinians denigrate themselves and told him, "The problem is us, not them. Look at Israel. A few decades ago, there was no Israel, and suddenly there's a country that everyone recognizes. It's permanent." Palestinians would need to look to the Israelis to learn how to build their country. Or another man in a tea shop told him, "Israel doesn't bomb everything, they only bomb the fighters." Very interesting in 2023, and I wonder what this Palestinian is currently thinking, because Israel is fucking bombing everything. The occupation thus enters the mind, it infects it, by forcing the colonized to blame themselves and the resistance. The PLO can thus be understood in this light too, as they were all for armed resistance, but Yasser Arafat gave up on liberation and tried to do things the so-called proper way, the civilized way, as he not only acknowledged Israel, but signed the Oslo Accords. Now his faction aids Israel. They beat and punish Palestinians in the West Bank. They try to escape their so-called jungle status by mirroring and imitating their colonizers. Occupation needs and feeds off a necropolitics, off carceral states. For all Palestinians can be imprisoned and tortured for years without even committing a crime. No, the crime is that they are Palestinians. For the colonizer's life is considered to be more worthy than the colonized. There is a need to dehumanize every single Palestinian, to see them as marauders, murderers, thieves, criminals, bloodthirsty, and Gaza. And Gaza is the jungle, the wild, the one frontier that needs to be tamed. It's this dehumanization that allows Israeli officials to unflinchingly call and commit a genocide, to unflinchingly kill tens of thousands and displace millions. Israel has tried to break the spirit of the Palestinians they occupy multiple times. As in the first Intifada, there was even a broken bones policy, where the Israeli occupational forces went house to house, brutally breaking the bones of young boys and men. It's been almost a yearly event where Israel bombs and murders Gazans in their sleep. And yet, some have the audacity to ask, why do they fight? Why do they resist? Under occupation, Palestinians cannot breathe. They cannot live a day of their lives without being targeted by violence. And this brings us to some deep sen's most offensive question, as he asked a Palestinian activist why he fights, why he still resists, despite being in such a hopeless scenario. Why do I fight? It's about power. Either you kick their asses or they do. Resistance allows one to exist. and survive. Fighting is part of being Palestinian. Resisting is an unmaking of suffering, because at some point one has to say that enough is enough. But by being under a carceral occupation and being dehumanized for over 75 years, resistance seeks out not to simply destroy, but to many, it allows them to regain their humanity and heal traumas. To focus simply on the occupation of Palestinians would be disingenuous of me, because there are a lot of Jews in Israel who do not want to be there, who cannot speak against the occupation and the injustice. It's also been long documented that Israeli society has layers of social hierarchies, where European Jews are treated differently than Arab and African Jews. One of many examples being the sterilization of Ethiopian Jews. Some people in the comments are probably writing me essays, clanking down on their keyboards, claiming that I don't provide any solutions. But the solution is simple. End the occupation. Dissolve the Zionist colonial state. Give Palestinians the land that was stolen from them, and allow the creation for a democratic state where all people are equal. Because what's there now is a blatant apartheid ethno-state that mass murders people on the daily. Land back doesn't mean retaliating with genocide, and Jewish people who were once citizens of a settler colonial ethno-state will simply have to live in a state where all are equal. We now circle back to the eternal present, to resistance and the future. In the eternal present, we are witnessing political Zionism's true aims, and its genocide backed by colonialism and imperialism. Herzl and Ahmar Jabotinsky have always envisioned a complete conquered Palestine, void of Palestinians, so that a mostly white, militaristic, fascist society can thrive. Their successors carried that vision and have been terrorizing Palestinians for 75 years to pacify them, to break their spirits. And for a long time, the world sat idle. When October 7th happened, the global north screamed in agony that a united front broke the walls of Israel's biggest concentration camp. It brought Gazans a glimpse of freedom, and it was a declaration that enough is enough, that injustice must end. A question rose, and it was repeated over and over and over and over by every Western media that it became a meme. Do you condemn Hamas? However, the world hasn't been silent. And Israel's retaliation, their so-called self-defense, was quickly called a genocide, because it is. Millions since the 7th have taken to the street calling for an end to this genocide, and not only for a ceasefire, but for the end of the occupation. Jews, Muslims, and Christians have stood in solidarity with each other, which hasn't been seen since the days of South Africa, because this struggle is not a religious struggle, but an anti-colonial one, an anti-imperial one. Whether you're Jewish or Christian or Muslim or secular, there is no way you could watch this genocide, watch the pain, the suffering, and the death, and claim that this is about religion, because it isn't.
All of this of front of the world, they lie to the world that they kill the parties, but they kill the people of Gaza, their dreams and their future.
All people have been affected. All feel the pain, feel the sorrow, and all hear the screams and the cries of children. All want this to end. It doesn't matter where you're from, in our thousands, in our millions, we are all Palestinians.
In our thousands, in our millions, we are all Palestinians. In our thousands, in our millions, we are all Palestinians.
This is a global resistance, a resistance that doesn't simply stand with Palestine, but Hawaii, Congo, Sudan, and all oppressed people. This is history in the making, and if you're angry, you're human. If you're sad, you're human. if you can't sleep at night, it means that you are human. But if you're unshaken, if you're apathetic, it means that you lack humanity. You're the type of person Fanon despised. For those unshaken, being all smug and playing both sides, I want you to take a good, hard look at this bloody history and reflect. Challenge yourself like Fanon did. And I hope, and I really do hope, this video shakes someone. Because how do you watch an ongoing genocide and place the blame on the Palestinians? How the fuck dare you question why they resist? I swear, I saw someone ask, why don't they just leave? Why don't they just go to Egypt, or Syria, or Jordan, or Lebanon? When that's the definition of ethnic cleansing, you stupid fucks! Resistance thus isn't about destruction, but it's about love. It's about an undoing of suffering. It's deeply spiritual, deeply economic, and deeply cultural. Resistance is all about the future. It's about screaming and shouting and fighting and struggling against a loss of a future and against the wretched of the earth. By resisting both the United Front, the Gazans who are still standing, unmoved, unwavering, unshaken, and us, the people on the streets, have opened paths towards a liberated future. Resistance allows those who are deemed inhuman to regain their humanity, to breathe in a suffocating occupation, and to dream of futures. Dreams that stem from 1917, that have been passed on to 1926, to 1936, to 1948, to 1956, to 2006, and 2023. They're dreams of refugees, of children, of women, of queer people and revolutionary fighters who are still alive today. It's a dream that's as powerful as time, that weaves in and out of time, forever touching hearts and minds of every insan. It's a dream of a free Palestine, and its flag spurs conviction that Palestine hasn't been lost, that Palestinians are still there, they still exist, and they will never cease to be. It's a dream that spurs one to fight and to end the nightmare that is Israel's occupation of Palestine and political Zionism, for they are the wretched of the earth. As of recording, the bombs are still dropping. The pause has ended. The genocide, the death continues. This is reality. I wrote and edited this video with a deep pain in my heart. Despite this feeling and the pain, the aim of this video isn't simply to educate people. It wasn't made for entertainment, but to urge you into action. We, the people, can stop this genocide. I urge you to protest. I urge you to link up with your Palestinian local community and follow their lead. I urge you to use this pain, your anger, frustration, and disgust to take a stand. Maybe I'm too romantic, but I truly believe that the dream of a liberated Palestine is worth fighting for. I think in times of despair, even in times where Palestinians are being murdered, we mustn't give in to despair and give up. Gaza is still fighting, and Palestine will not die.
أنا أفتخر إني وأرفع راسي فوق عالي إنه أنا من منطقة في يوم من الأيام كل العالم اتآمر عليها وكل العالم حاربها.
Maybe my words will give people courage to keep standing, to keep fighting, because the dream of a liberated Palestine, the future of Palestine, hasn't being lost. It isn't a lost future.
Yamete お前らには俺は殺せねえよ。よう。人はいつ死ぬと思う？人に忘れられた時さ。俺が消えても俺の夢は叶う。病んだ国民の心もきっと救えるさ。なぜに泣く？ドルトン。国も同じだろうか。受け継ぐ者がいりゃな。おいおいドルトン、てめえ何だ。
This video realistically doesn't have an end, because Palestinians are entrapped in an eternal present, a present that doesn't end until all of Palestine is liberated. Until then, we must simply continue to weave this story. Palestine is no longer alone. As of recording, South Africa has taken Israel to international court. If it gets vetoed, I called it first, but inshallah it doesn't. Yemen continues to stand in solidarity with Palestine, seizing ships heading to aid the genocide. To the people of Yemen, who are currently being bombed by America and the UK, you have my admiration, and believe me, you've given every single Arab in the entire world hope. And so I proudly stand with Yemen. But yeah, the toughest thing when making a video modeled off the circular mode of history is ending it, because there really isn't an end to this story. In that light, there will be future videos. The next one is going to be on liberal Zionism, as I didn't get the chance in this video to truly dunk on Jabotinsky. If you're interested in more, subscribe and keep an eye out for them. There's a rumor that Dr. Fatima's next video will also continue the story. I collaborated a bit in helping with the research, and I didn't want to plagiarize her Hamas part, so that's kind of why I didn't dedicate an entire part on them and rather focused on Algeria and Fana. She actually convinced me to make this, and so thank her, I guess. I really hope this video has value, as making something that exceeds 1 hour and 30 minutes really worries me because I don't know how engaging it is. So let me know if you learned something, or if you have any questions, or areas where I could have gone deeper, or maybe you fell asleep and this was like a history lecture that you just found incredibly boring and long, and it's like, you know, when's the guy gonna get to the point? When is he gonna talk about Hamas? This video's gotta have some Hamas in it, and there's a lack of Hamas, so I'm sorry about that. But yeah, this video was really heavy, and it was hard to make, but it was intentionally made to affect you. So if it made you feel something, anything, let me know down below in the comments. Anyways, thanks so much for watching. And if you've made it to this point, I really hope you enjoyed how I went all out with the One Piece Palestine connections. They're there for those who really, truly watch my videos to the end. They're the true Lost Future fans. But thanks for the wait, and that's it. I'm done. This is it. This is the end. For now, don't forget to say Free Palestine, not from Hamas, but from political Zionism and Israeli colonization. Salam, I'll catch you next time.